Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to a brand new weird little video on laptop tech and the stuff you stuff inside laptops tech video. This one being getting a cheap 4TB AliExpress SSD to work. Now, this intriguing title probably invites more questions than it answers. The first two obvious ones being, why am I using a weird cheap SSD from AliExpress rather than using an NVMe drive, which I've already figured out how to make work through the Express port on all my other Thinkpads, the T400 and 500 range Thinkpads that I have? Which is a good question. Linked to it, though, is the other question of, why am I using a Lenovo ThinkPad Edge, albeit a G3, a third generation processor one, an E530, instead of one of the 500 or 400 series ThinkPads aimed at the business market, which tended to be more robust and have more features? Well, suffice to say, the ThinkPad Edge E530 is going to get its own video in which I've done several things to it, because I got it because I wanted a laptop I didn't care too much about to use as a test bed for various weird things I wanted to do. And it just turns out that, as an accident, getting this weird SSD from AliExpress to work is one of those things that I've accidentally ended up testing on it. And I'm going to release this part of its history first so I can explain about these weird AliExpress 4TB and other capacity SSDs that they have on sale for stupidly cheap money. Which got me very suspicious, but I also thought, well, it's so cheap, I might as well test it on this new test machine I've got. Suffice to say, I've made many alterations, or at least quite a few alterations to the E530, and that will get its own video shortly. But this one alteration, the installation of this weird SSD, is what we're going to focus on today. And to complete what I was saying about the NVMe drive, these cheaper home user focused ThinkPad Edges did not have Express card slots, and so there was no way I was going to be able to get an NVMe drive in it, although I did try various different ways to try and get NVMe drives to interface with it, but failed utterly. At which point I thought, okay, I'm done here. I might as well just buy a standard SSD and stuff it into the SATA slot, which was at this point lying empty because it was actually running off the mSATA slot with a standard mSATA SSD in there. And it still has that there now. And it's lucky I did it that way because it enabled me to do what I've done today with this weird AliExpress SSD. One final thing. The Edge 530 was a tempting test bed because it only cost me 30 quid off eBay, including the postage. And this is, of course, how they sold it to me, because it was on there for £30 plus £10 postage. But with make an offer, I made an offer of £20 and they accepted it. So I had to pay £30 to buy this laptop. So I've already quickly talked about how I tried to get an NVMe to work with it, but that wasn't going to happen. Oh, if anyone does manage to get an NVMe drive to work with an Edge 530, then please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to know how you managed to do it. But what I've discovered might prevent you even bothering to try and do that, as you'll find out shortly. So as I say, having failed to get an NVMe drive to interface with the E530, off I went looking for cheap, standard mSATA, actually initially SSDs, to put into it. And then I figured, well, it actually has an empty SATA bay in it, because I chucked out the old-fashioned mechanical drive it did have as I was trying to do other things with it, and it was just running with mSATA and an empty SATA base. So then I looked also for cheap SATA SSDs, and while doing that on AliExpress, these weirdly cheap and quite high capacity SSDs popped up in my search, where initially I was looking for 2TB. The 2TB SSD was about £20. I then clicked across and found the 4TB one was just about under £25, just a bit over £26 with the postage. I thought, how on earth can it be this cheap? Well, I was suspicious the second I saw them that cheap and thought, how have they done this? Scanning down the description of them, I found one or two clues that they might be based on SD cards, which made me instantly very dubious about them. I've tried to use SD cards in the past as hard drives, and it always fails, at least under Linux, because they cannot deal with the higher security file systems that Linux likes to use, ext4 or even NTFS, which is actually a Microsoft one, but they SD cards cannot cope with being formatted to those formats and cannot run as hard drives effectively, at least under Linux. It might work under Windows with the more loose, floppy, crappy MS-DOS based file systems that they still use to this day. But this is a Linux-based video, as all my laptop videos end up being. So with a Linux focus, I knew SD cards were not good for using as hard drives on the Thinkpads under Linux. But for the cheapness of them, as I say, about £25 for a 4 terabyte drive, I thought, I'll give it a go. That's what this test machine was for anyway. Let's test some stuff out. So the first thing I tried to do was clone the 2 terabyte drive that's actually on my T420 straight onto the weird new SSD, which arrived very quickly from AliExpress. As I say, it must have arrived in about 3 days maximum from ordering it. And that wasn't with the expedited shipping. That was normal shipping. So well done, AliExpress, once more. When it arrived, as I say, I tried to clone the 2 terabyte drive off my T420 straight onto it, which it claimed to do perfectly, that it copied it all across. But once on there, nothing could read it. No other operating system could see it. I plugged it directly in as the E530's main drive, and it couldn't see it and wouldn't read it. So that didn't work. The next thing I tried was I took out the E530's mSATA card that it runs off, left the not working weird 4 terabyte SSD from AliExpress in it, and then booted off the Linux Mint 18 XFC install CD, which I did so that I could then try a direct install to the drive itself of Mint without having the existing mSATA drive in there causing confusion or problems for the Mint install CD. So it could only see, if it could see it, that one drive. Turns out it could see the 4 terabyte drive in all its glory, even though I'd cloned a 2 terabyte drive onto it, which should have kind of left it with a 2 terabyte chunk on it. It just decided to see the whole 4 terabyte drive. It installed onto it almost perfectly. It went all the way through the install, and then right at the end, the install crashed, saying it couldn't install Grub on the 4 terabyte SSD, which was weird. And after I got rid of the errors, I looked on the home directory that it had created, and all the files were there for Mint on this 4 terabyte drive that apparently it couldn't write Grub to. I then immediately remembered how I got the NVMe drives to work by having Grub on the small mSATA and then changing the Grub there so that it was using the NVMe drive. I put the mSATA back into the E530, booted off that, used Grub Customizer, and lo and behold, it could see. In fact, before I did that, I booted up and I could see the install on the 4 terabyte weird AliExpress drive was actually there. If you turned on the list of installed operating systems in the Grub install, you could see it. So I actually booted into it using the selection from the boot list on Grub, and it went in fine, at which point I thought, my God, it's working. So then I changed the boot order, as you'll see here, and lo and behold, by using Grub Customizer, shifting the order around, I can get the Edge 530 to boot off this weird 4 terabyte SD card based SSD, as far as I can see. Two things. One, there's an image on the advert with an SD card actually shown on it, which made me suspicious about its setup. And it talked a lot about NAND memory in the description. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it's running off SD cards. But by doing this workaround, I managed to get it to boot off this usually unbootable SD card based SSD. It's not without its quirks, but then booting off the NVMe drives is not without the quirks either. But I'll now show you what it's like booting to the Edge E530 into its mSATA card first. So you can see this kind of speed it goes in with and the lack of weirdness when it goes in that way. And then I'll show you it going into what's now its standard 4 terabyte AliExpress weirdness SSD. Okay, my hands come in so I can actually select the operating system I want, which is not that one. It is that one. So this is the mSATA install. And it's quite leisurely on the install, but it has no errors. Let's put it that way. This is one of the things that made my eyes perk up when I installed from the 4TB one. Is you can see it's a little bit leisurely. Oh, helps if I put the right password in. Let's try that again. See, talking and typing, I'm not good at. So it's fairly brisk as it goes in, running off the mSATA drive, and it's not doing anything particularly weird. Let's put it that way. Now let's get it to boot into the new 4TB one. By the way, you can see it. Boink. There it is, 4TB volume. And you can see the file system. But I'm pretty sure that if I try to go into any directory, let me try and go in the home directory. Oh, it works. Oh, that's unusual. Okay, apparently everything can be seen now. So before I couldn't go into the file system, but now apparently I can even browse the file system of the weird 4TB AliExpress drive, even when installed on the mSATA drive, which is great. But now I'm going to install into the weird AliExpress 4TB drive. So I'm going to reboot it. Let's get my hands in shot as I attempt to turn this thing on and send it into the weird 4TB AliExpress SSD as its install medium. Which I shouldn't have to do anything for. Its default is exactly that. So I can just leave it to go straight through. But watch, there's a lot more chattiness in the install of the 4TB SSD from AliExpress. But also, despite its chattiness, it's quite quick, which is one of the first things that made me think this thing might not be as slow as the mSATA drive. And then, again, pretty quickly, bang, into the OS. Done. So this is a fast, it seems, 4TB. Now, just in case this apparent increased speed with this weird SSD from AliExpress was just my optimistic brain causing illusions of grandeur for this SSD, I then tested it. And I've got the results already printed out. I tested it against several things, and I'll flash the results up on the screen. You don't want to watch me just running disks under Ubuntu doing its benchmarking, but I can just give you the results. So the mSATA drive was significantly slower than the 4TB drive. The mSATA, as you'll see now on screen, had a read speed of about 270 megabits per second and write speed of about 230 megabits per second, whereas the weird 4TB drive had read speeds of about 530 megabits per second and write speed of over 450 megabits per second, way quicker than the mSATA drive. And actually, I then tested the T420's drives. It had the mSATA of its own, 1TB one, and also its 2TB NVMe drive. And its mSATA drive was almost exactly the same speed results of the mSATA on the E530 here. And even its NVMe drive was slower than this weird thing off AliExpress, with its read speed of about 400 megabits per second and its write speed of about 360. So yeah, better than the mSATA, significantly better than the mSATA, but not as fast as this weird thing off AliExpress, which is running through a SATA slot. So I have no idea how AliExpress and their manufacturers have managed to get a hard drive that runs faster through a SATA slot than an NVMe drive is running through the Express card slot. Which, yeah, I at this point, you can probably guess, I'll probably buy my next SSD. The T530 needs an upgrade. It needs a larger SSD in it, really. I will probably buy one of these AliExpress SSDs and stuff it in the T530 and use that as its main drive once I've reconfigured it in the way I have with the Edge 530 here. But wait! They do say if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And in the case of this 4 terabyte SSD, this seems to be the case. I forgot to mention in the earlier section, I did have some other weird suspicions about this SSD drive before it ultimately failed, which I'm about to show you now, in that when I installed things through Mint's software manager, it would install, and then at the very end of install, say it was unable to install, and then weirdly, immediately afterwards, the thing would be installed and you could run it. And I was going to demonstrate that in a quick addition to the video, but when I tried to start the laptop, it came up with a bunch of errors. The first one being an error that would be familiar to anyone who's seen the video I did about making the SATA bay or SATA bay into a Wi-Fi card, in that throws up an error because there's no real hard drive in the hard drive bay, which would be expected because it's now acting like a Wi-Fi card. But this time, this one was doing it, and there is meant to be a real hard drive in the hard drive bay, the AliExpress SSD, so that really doesn't make any sense. After going through that error, it did boot up once or twice, but with loads of errors coming up, and ultimately having it crash once or twice as well. And now, well, I'll show you what happens when I boot up. We'll see what it does this time. I expect it to come up with the hard drive missing error, and then half the time it doesn't even bring the grub up, which is really weird because that's on the SATA card inside, and that should be the first thing it goes to. But let's see what happens. Okay, it's come up with the splash menu, which is good. And now it's going through errors, taking a very long time. And this is normally where it fails. Okay, this time it's gone in. For some reason is now working. Like I say, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, it's seeing the home drive. It knows how big it is. Let's see if the Dropbox is working. Okay. Okay, all of this is working so far. So this time it's decided to work. So it's so unreliable, I can't even make it not work reliably. Let's see if it bring up... oh, even that bit's working. Okay. This is not great. So it's so unreliable, it can't even show me when it's not being reliable reliably. Are you going to work? Right, this is more like it. Taking forever to load Firefox in this case. So this is more in line with this. So if it does go incorrectly, as it has done, it starts to really bog down very quickly and not work well. In fact, okay, so this example is when it does go incorrectly, but half the time it doesn't go incorrectly at all. There we go. So it's just failed to load Firefox entirely. I think now it'll probably throw up an error when I try and shut it down, but let's find out. Right. Now it won't even open the menus properly. So we were lucky that it got into the operating system at all. Half the time it won't. This time it did, but now you can see it's actually freezing and not loading anything, which is probably because it's not actually accessing the hard drive properly. Yeah, there we go. So I can't even shut it down. So I'll now have to manually restart it, and let's see what happens if I go in a second time. Okay, so we're off. Let's see what happens this time. Very slow. Okay, this time it won't even start with the hard drive in, let alone get to the error that it's been causing. So yeah, unfortunately the 4 terabyte SSD from AliExpress does not seem to be stable. It does pretty much what I've had happen when I've tried to use SD cards as hard drives before, at least using EXT or NTFS. It can't cope with it, and they become corrupt very quickly, even if they work at all, which most of the time they don't. So it looks like this really was too good to be true, which is very unfortunate because those read-write speeds were very impressive for something that was plugged into a SATA slot, but it does seem that it was too good to be true. So in short, I will not be putting one of these mega cheap 4 terabyte SSDs into the T530 as its new expanded hard drive. I'll have to go and buy a more expensive proper SATA drive to shove in it, or I could use an NVMe drive if I can afford to splash out on that, and use that in its express card slot. But that's the end of this video now. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was in some way useful, informative, and has prevented you from buying any temptingly cheap massive SSDs off AliExpress that ultimately do not work, at least not under a Linux system. Maybe they would work under Windows using a simple FAT file system, maybe, but I haven't tested that, so I wouldn't even trust it for that necessarily. Until the next video, whatever that may be, thank you all for watching, and until then, take care.
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, masters, mistresses.